I must confess that the title for this video is rather provocative, but all information you see here being presented is absolutely accurate. And yes, leftism is a predictor of mental illnesses and could be argued is a mental disorder by itself using a sociobiological analysis, though as Emil Kierkegaard in his 2020 paper had concluded that it is yet unknown to what extent mentally ill people select into extreme left-wing ideologies or those left-wing ideologies themselves produce mental illnesses. What is known is that extreme liberalism or Marxism independently predicts a higher rate of mental illnesses across all studies when controlled for other factors, and this video is dedicated towards illustrating all of that in a legible manner, as well as talking about the reasons why it is the case and the wider social implications that are tied with it. And before I go into stating the possible explanations for such an outcome, I will have to prove that leftism and liberalism predict mental illness in the first place. In a recent 2020 paper, it was reported that liberals had a 150% increase in the rate of mental illnesses compared to the moderates, while conservatives and extreme conservatives were less likely to be mentally ill in comparison to the moderates. Especially malfunctioning outcomes were with Marxists and with social democrats, while the most mentally stable were conservatives and those part of the alt-right. And that picture is pretty much repeated with all recent surveys and studies, with those even younger being way more likely to be diagnosed with mental illnesses, which can be explained by an increase in diagnosis, current environmental conditions, and the selection for dysgenic traits that occurred and continue to trouble the world since the Industrial Revolution, where genetically unfit people are being able to reproduce, but that is a story for another day, so let me not bother you with that one for now. But if you're curious, you can dig up some Michael Woodley and his research, as well as the very recent studies done on that topic. Besides that, leftists also show a tendency towards other maladaptive behaviors, such as adopting degenerative lifestyles, which include their risky sexual behaviors, and as a consequence, surprisingly lower satisfaction from sex, increased substance abuse, and the much higher crime rate than conservatives, which is confirmed both longitudinally and cross-sectionally. And if you're gonna say here, oh well, it's all because males and blacks were included. Yes, but even when they are controlled for that, the results still hold the same for whites and for females, and the difference is still one standard deviation, as the study had reported. Not to also mention that liberals tend to be less physically attractive than conservatives, and as we know, physical attractiveness is associated with healthier lifestyles and a lack of mental illnesses. But anyways, those were just the bonuses that I had found while doing the research. What I'd like you to focus your attention now is the possible reasons for those cases of mental illnesses among leftists. And I feel like I cannot explain it fully without looking at race. You see, although leftism per se is a predictor of mental illnesses for the general population, white leftists seem to be particularly affected by it, and the best explanation regarding that is the fact that leftism teaches whites of white privilege and that they are the scum of the earth who should decolonize and dismantle their own existence. So perhaps internalizing attitudes among white leftists might explain those rates of higher mental illnesses and depression, as it is often the go explanation when it comes to explaining the depression rate among non-heterosexuals. In addition, that may be the go explanations of why the depression rates are so low among the far right, who on the other hand are healthier because they seem to love themselves, even though the society pretty much hates them and want them gone. And also, if you're gonna say that there are other factors that play a more significant role, such as being highly educated bourgeois and having a higher income, know that it is not supported by the evidence, as income and education negatively correlates with mental illnesses, at least in 2007, to the contrary of what you would expect. However, other study reported the opposite relationship for women, at least when it came to depression and anxiety. It did not look at mental illnesses, so my previous point stands. Also adding on that, there seems to be a 7-fold increase in depression and anxiety rates of students in the lefty-dominated institutions, which only proves my point that leftism causes mental dysfunctionality to people once they are exposed to it, at least temporarily. But I could not find any data of a positive relationship between education and an increase in mental illnesses. Only temporary and mental dysfunctionality like depression and anxiety that I could find. Now let me finish with the race part. In the 2018 ANES survey, all racial groups except white liberals showed a racial bias in favor of their group, which is to say that white liberals put themselves below other races, in other words being pathologically altruistic, or in a more academic words, internalizing their own oppression. And why should we not classify it as a disorder? As Google's definition of a disorder is that which results in causing significant difficulty, distress, impairment, and/or suffering in a person's daily life. But enough with that. What are the other reasons of that besides the indoctrination? I would make the case that it is the moral circle of a typical lefty that is to blame here, and it is malfunctioning from a sociobiological perspective, which focuses on survival in terms of physical fitness and both group and individual selection. Leftists are not just more universal than conservatives in their morality. They also happen to be allocating more resources to things that are not beneficial for their own survival, such as all things in existence, and as a result they adopt maladaptive behaviors such as animal rights, such as multiculturalism, which would be the direct result of their moral failings. That quite ironically undermine their own rate of survival as they do not allocate enough resources to themselves. Them having way less children than conservatives can be directly tied with their own maladaptive behavior as they are choosing the K strategy, refusing to have as much kids as conservatives, and throughout time the gap between liberals and conservatives had increased drastically. They not only identify with the whole humanity more, not equal to their own country or their family, that by the way many of them also choose not to have, but also they happen to morally allocate resources equally to humans and non-humans. Now, I wonder, when do we extend human rights to animals? Oh, wait a second, fuck. And there are more confirmations of that besides the surveys, of course, and studies by Jonathan Haidt, as there was a lot of neurological research which practically concluded that leftists lack many important qualities of a healthy human being, or have them to a diminished degree, which in result makes them have diminished emotional responses to negative stimuli, disgust levels, and most importantly, understanding of danger, which all predicts low survival ability. So it is no wonder that they operate in ways that they do, they just have an impaired self-protection instinct. One thing I found very telling in particular while doing this research is that mental degeneration, or BVFTD, in conservatives' brain makes them adopt a leftist ideology. And yeah, if you're wondering what it is like to have BVFTD, it is basically just leftism in a nutshell, as it includes all the symptoms that I had previously identified, that are reduced attention to aversive threat, decreased reactivity to disgusting stimuli, and impair the drive for self-protection, and etc. And partially that would also explain their toleration for ambiguity, as intolerance of ambiguity is often perceived as a threat. So in addition to the underestimation and reduced attention to threat, low ethnocentrism, fucked up moral circle, crime rates, and other bisocial maladaptability, which also includes, by the way, having fewer children and a personal shtick towards actively dismantling their own culture, there is one more variable that may explain their mental health problems and why their behavior is similar to a disorder. And that is their virtue signaling behavior that aligns closely not just with mental illnesses but with a dark triad personality disorder, in particularly the Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy traits. So I guess another thing to explore, although this study did not say that it was specifically leftists who were doing that, but let's be honest, who does the most amount of virtue signaling? And if you are a left-wing person hearing all of this, you might be filled up with anger as of right now. You'll probably object and say, wait a minute, how dare you pathologize the left? It is the right which scores higher on authoritarian personality disorder, typically has lower IQs if controlled for race that we leftists don't actually believe exist in the first place, both race and IQ, not to mention conservative whites are just as racist as non-white liberals or conservatives, so suck it up, bigot. And to that I will respond that high ethnocentrism is a positive thing from the evolutionary perspective, not to mention that the opposite is not beneficial, and it is the reason of such a diminished mental and physical health outcomes among the white leftists, not to even speak of leftism eventually being outbreeded as a result of their failing case strategy. And I'd like to make it clear for those leftists filled up with anger that I'm not saying that all leftists are mentally ill people, as even with Marxists this number is less than 50%. What I'm saying, however, is that the average is what matters, since leftism as an ideology is malfunctioning because it causes more crime, depression, maladaptive behaviors, even including having less children and low ethnocentrism with whites, and as a result some people may consider it a disorder, including myself. Even if we concede that some or many mentally ill people choose leftism as their preferred ideology as a result of their mental illness, by the way, that does not make leftism reputable, right? That does not undermine the huge racial differences among whites in mental illnesses, as well as their depression rates skyrocketing while adopting far-left beliefs. Leftism as an ideology promotes not just universalism, but also the deconstruction of self if they happen to be white, and behaviors like that correlate strongly with the decrease in the perception of threat and survival, which again correlates strongly with mental illnesses and could be argued is a disorder. Genetics are of course important, but in this case and among whites, I believe that the environment is responsible for at least 60% of them adopting leftist maladaptive behavior, and as a result many of them become mentally ill. And this is all that I wanted to say today, as well that I want there to be less maladaptive behaviors, of course, before I hand in the cherry on the cake coming from a 2019 Cato Institute survey, which had found that just 33% of people identifying as a very liberal agreed that their life is determined by their own actions, compared to 52% of those who are very conservative. That is to say, leftists not only have little control of their own lives, but also are adopting things highly associated with the authoritarian personality disorder, which I guess is pretty ironic if you're familiar with the history of authoritarian personality disorder, in addition to their other dysfunctionalities and frankly their fetishization, especially of depression, autism, and people with ADHD, as well as sexual deviance. Fat people are all encouraged to embrace themselves, stimulating and rewarding even more maladaptive behavior in the future, creating a mental health crisis that also best can be seen on student campuses. Isn't that great, guys? And on that note, I finish the video pledging you all to subscribe to my channel, as I have planned an intellectually revolutionary way of understanding the contemporary politics and ways in which we can make the society healthier.